Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the Tufts Faculty Webinar Series. This series is a new initiative being launched by the Tufts University Alumni Association to provide continuing education to our alumni around the world. We will be offering live, one-hour webinars throughout the academic year on relevant topics delivered by some of the most dynamic faculty on campus. For all our attendees, your audio has been turned off. So if you would like to ask any questions, please type them into the chat box in the lower right of your screen. If there are any questions that go unaddressed before our 1 p.m. stop time, then we will follow up with an email. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Professor Zarin Machanda, who will be discussing the Great Ape Extinction Crisis.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thank you very much, Joda, and good afternoon to everyone. So today I am very pleased to offer a Tufts Faculty webinar series on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, which is conservation. And specifically what I'm going to talk about today is the Great Ape Extinction Crisis. And I just want to point out that there are going to be, through the talk, some disturbing images, partly because when we're talking about conservation, some of the things that are happening to the animals are actually pretty sad and are pretty difficult to hear or to see. And so I'm sorry if some of these images are disturbing, but that is the reality of the world that we are living in. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm a professor of anthropology here at Tufts University. I'm in my second year. And I'm also a biological anthropologist, which means that I study kind of how we can use biological principles and theories to understand human evolution and the human species. And part of biological anthropology is the study of primates. And so I am actually a primatologist who studies wild chimpanzee behavior in Uganda. I am the director of one of the directors of the Kibale Chimpanzee Project, which is a long-term study of wild chimpanzees in southwestern Uganda. We've been studying the same group of chimps for about 30 years. And if you happen to catch my last webinar, which was in October, I talked a little bit about their behavior and showed some videos from that site. And you can always check that out. It will be posted, so you can watch that retroactively if you want. I'm also one of the directors of a community development project called the Cassini Project, which is a project that focuses on education around the national park that I work in Uganda, and really trying to make the lives of children who live around the national park a little bit better. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about both the Chimp Project and this Cassini Project a little bit towards the end of the talk. Because even though one is my research project and the other is a community development project, they very much are both focused on conservation. And I think it's one of the solutions that we have come up with. Both of these projects are solutions that we have come up with to try to stop a little bit of this extinction crisis that we're facing. And so today what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about how many primates are endangered and kind of what the numbers are like to put some of this stuff into perspective. I'll talk about some of the specific threats that primates face, and especially the great apes face, and some solutions. And I will say, you know, one of the amazing things about my job is that it continuously evolves. And so when I started my PhD a long time ago, now, I don't think anyone would have, I would have told you 10, 15 years from now, I'm going to be studying wild chimpanzees, not I'm going to be the director of a community development education project in Uganda or working very tirelessly on conservation. But the reality of studying a species that is endangered and may not actually be around for the rest of my life means that as someone who is really deeply committed to understanding chimpanzee behavior, I also have to be deeply committed to conserving them as a species. And so, it doesn't surprise me anymore that almost 50% of my time is actually spent on conservation efforts, because I actually do have to have an animal to study at the end of the day. And I hope, there is going to be some doom and gloom in this talk, because the crisis is pretty severe, But hopefully at the end of the talk, I'll leave you with some lessons and some solutions that you can kind of use in your everyday life. So let's start by actually focusing on some numbers and giving you some numbers to really understand how severe this crisis is. So these are the International Conservation Union numbers for endangered animals and plants around the world. So what we're looking at are data that I've compiled across different taxa to show how many, the percent of species that are in some way threatened. So they're either classified as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And by critically endangered, we mean that they're basically almost extinct in the wild, and we have populations maybe in captivity. And what you can see is actually quite startling, that I don't think most people realize how threatened plants are around the world, but more than 50% of the plant species around the world are threatened in some way, threatened by extinction in some way. And then different types of animals are going to be threatened differentially. So amphibians are quite sensitive to ecological variation because they have lifespans that require both a terrestrial part and an aquatic part. So any sort of perturbation in one of those systems is going to affect them. So amphibians are often really, really threatened by extinction. And then we have things like mollusks. About 20% of the world's mammals are endangered by extinction. Birds, et cetera. I mean, so different types of species are going to be threatened differentially. What's very surprising is when you actually plot this data and separate out the primates from the mammals, so a primate is a type of mammal, what you see is that 60% of primate species around the world are threatened with extinction. And that's, you know, they are a mammal, so there's something very different about primates that makes them vulnerable to extinction as a mammal. And this is really, you know, it's partly their habitat, it's partly their lifestyle, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So let's look at how this gets distributed around the world. What I'm showing here is a map of primate ranges, and you can see that a lot of primates from the map, those kind of hot spots where it's yellow and red, those are areas where we find a lot of primate species. So what you can see is that primates are generally living around the equator. And that's because most primate habitat is tropical rainforest, which is found around the equator. What we also can see from the graphs at the bottom are how many, this is a different analysis of how many species are threatened globally and how many in the green bars divided up into the kind of main areas and how many species are in decline. And so you can see globally, this survey finds about 55% of all primate species are threatened, but 75% of species around the world are in declining populations. And this definitely differs by continent. So the main areas of concern for primatologists are Madagascar and Asia. So Madagascar primates, so Madagascar is that island off the coast on the east of Africa labeled 103 there, which is 103 species. And you can see 100% of the Malagasy primates are in decline, 87% are threatened. And in Asia, we see 95% of populations are in decline and 73% are threatened. So there are definitely pockets of the world where we're more concerned. And what's really interesting is that about 2/3 of primate species in the world are actually found in 4 countries. So Indonesia, Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Brazil. If we concentrated conservation efforts in just those 4 countries, we actually would be able to cover about 67% of all primate species in the world. Now, as I said, a lot of primate habitat is going to be tropical rainforest, and tropical rainforests in general are in decline. And I want to just point out that this idea that tropical rainforests are particularly vulnerable is not necessarily new. A biologist from the 19th century, Alfred Russel Wallace, who many of you will know as the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection by evolution with Charles Darwin, did a lot of his data collection in the Malay archipelago. And he wrote in 1869, so over 100 years ago, this very prophetic quote: "Should civilized man ever reach these distant lands and bring moral, intellectual, and physical light into the recesses of these virgin forests, we may be sure that he will so disturb the nicely balanced relations of organic and inorganic nature as to cause the disappearance and finally the extinction of these very beings whose wonderful structure and beauty he alone is fitted to appreciate and enjoy. This consideration must surely tell us that all living things were not made for man. And I think, this is someone who was writing over 100 years ago and could already tell that these rainforests, these tropical rainforests, were special, but also very finely balanced. And any sort of disturbance in these habitats was probably going to affect that incredible web of life that required that kind of balance. So primates, one reason they're vulnerable is that most of them are living in these tropical rainforests, but there are also lots of other characteristics of primates that make them particularly vulnerable, or make any species predisposes them to extinction. So I just put I put some of these characteristics on this slide, but things like a small population size or low population density is obviously going to affect the threat of extinction. Small geographic ranges, if they're found on islands, so think about Madagascar being an island. If they're high on the trophic level, so if they're kind of high on the food chain, because then they're going to be vulnerable to anything that happens below them on the food chain. Slow life history, so anything that grows up very slowly, because if you're growing up very slowly, you're not having babies very often, so you can't replace your population. Living in complex social structures, because if you perturb that balance and you don't have that kind of complexity, or you take out, maybe you lose, females or males might be more particularly vulnerable to certain threats, that might upset your whole balance. So all of these things kind of combine to make a species very, predisposes them to extinction. And all of these characteristics in general are things that you would use to describe primates. And in particular, they're things that we would use not just to describe primates, but to describe the great apes. So primates we often think of as monkeys and apes. And the apes are the larger-bodied primates. They're the ones that don't have tails. They're the chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos. And they are the ones that are large, and they have the slowest life history. So they take the longest time to grow up of all of the primates. And we are a great ape, so you can understand how long we take to grow up. That's not that different from how the apes grow up, except we don't sleep on our parents' couches when we're 24, but or they don't, we do, they don't. They get kicked out. And I would like to point out that even Charles Darwin in 1867, 2 years before Wallace wrote his piece, he even, Darwin, kind of the father of evolutionary biology, also wrote in a letter, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. So still, again, over 100 years ago, there was something about these apes that biologists had an idea that they were fragile and they were living in these habitats and they were going to be vulnerable to extinction. So let me show you some numbers, particularly for the great apes. These are numbers that I compiled from survey data that's taken over the last, from 2000 to 2014. And what we can see is, so these are the four great apes, the basic categories of great apes that we recognize. In blue on the right are the bonobos, which are kind of, some people will refer to them as pygmy chimpanzees. They live in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we think that there are about 50,000 of them. But to be honest, the surveys in the Democratic Republic of Congo they're hard to do because of all of the political issues that are going on there. Surveys of orangutans, who are in purple next, are much better, and we think that there are about 50,000 left, but I'll talk a little bit more about their numbers specifically a little bit later. And then the two other, in the orangutans live in Indonesia, so they're the Asian ape. And then the two other African apes, the gorillas and the chimpanzees, in red and green respectively, are actually doing a lot better. Gorillas in general have about 200,000 individuals in the wild left. This is really interesting because about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, that number was actually 100,000, and then some people did a survey in the Democratic Republic of Congo and found a population of 100,000 gorillas that no one had known about before. So there are still maybe potentially pockets of apes hiding in the world that we don't know about. There probably aren't that many, but we did double the number of gorillas in the world. But they're doing okay. And then chimpanzees, there are about 250 to 300,000 chimpanzees in the wild left. So of all of the apes, we're kind of more confident. We think we can kind of do more to save them because we have this larger population size. But these numbers mask a little bit of the variation because within each of those 4 categories, we actually have subspecies or different populations. And so we can actually break it up and show you the numbers for the different subspecies of apes. So there are the Western lowland gorillas are the ones where we found 100,000 individuals. So we were able to, there are quite a number of them. But you can see that chimpanzees, even though we have approximately 300,000, that's not true of every subspecies. So different subspecies are going to have different numbers. And I do want to point out, even though we have a lot of gorillas left in the world, about 200,000, some of those populations are very, very small. So the Growers gorilla, the mountain gorilla, and the Cross River gorilla are represented by only a few thousand or a few hundred individuals. And the mountain gorillas are the ones that most people know because they're the species that Diane Fossey studied. And there are probably, the last survey, which was just completed this summer, indicates that there are about 1,000 left. So we actually know every single mountain gorilla left in the world. They're all named. We know exactly where they are pretty much all the time. But 1,000 individuals is not a very strong, genetically viable population at this point. So there are some subspecies where we are much, much more concerned about them. And I do want to point out, based on the survey data, we do have survey data going back quite a number of decades. And we do have data from British explorers and other people who have gone to these forests on the numbers of apes going back well into the 19th century. What I can tell you is that we can estimate that about 90% of the decrease happened in the 20th century. So most of these animals have been lost in the last 120 years. And that's what's really concerning for us, is that this has been an incredibly rapid population decline of the apes. So those are the numbers, and they are gloomy. There are some species where we are not really sure that we're going to be able to do much for. But let me now move on to thinking a little bit about why we seem to have some of these issues. Why do we have problems in these tropical forests? And obviously, one of the major issues is that climates are changing. So, for example, this is Lake Chad. This is a picture of Lake Chad in 1972, and this is Lake Chad in 2001. Lake Chad almost disappeared completely from off the Earth, which, you know, not in terms of primate loss, but in terms of fish loss. For example, we lost an enormous amount of diversity of fish because of the shrinking of Lake Chad. What's really interesting about this is that I think people are very quick to blame local populations for, you know, bad farming techniques or slash and burn agriculture, which will have changed the water tables. But actually, data seems to suggest that the reason that Lake Chad dried up had to do more with pollution that was coming in from Europe that was causing rainfall pattern differences in this area. And around the beginning of the 21st century, when Europe placed much stricter bans on emissions, what we actually find is that Lake Chad has recovered slightly. So some of these climate change problems are reversible, but obviously Lake Chad is still nowhere what it was 30 or 40 years ago. And I mean, I think there are probably debates we could have about climate change, but to be honest, as someone who works in these areas, I mean, even so, I've been working there for 15 years, and I can tell you that we used to be able to almost set our watches by the rainy and dry seasons, and now we can't anymore. I mean, sometimes they don't happen at all. Sometimes they're a month late. Sometimes the rains are so heavy, it just, you know, you can't, I mean, everything gets killed. All the plants get killed because they're so waterlogged. And so even in 15 years, I've noticed such amazing differences in the climate change. And our data from our field site shows that the average temperature at our field site has gone up 4 degrees Celsius, which is an enormous change over 30 years. So climates are changing, and that is going to have an impact on the tropical forests. We also know in most of the developing world that populations are growing, and populations, specifically rural populations around national parks, are growing. And so in Uganda, where I work, about the way that the demographics are structured, about 50% of the population is under the age of 15. And if 50% of the population is under the age of 15, those kids are going to grow up and need farmland and need to raise their families somewhere. And so populations are growing at this exponential rate, specifically in the developing world around these tropical forests. And just to show you some data that's been compiled on this, you can see that the growth in Asia and Africa is it's actually growing quite steadily. And so right now, I think the world's population is at 7.6 billion, which is higher than this estimate even predicted. And a lot of that population growth is happening in areas where primates also live. Another big reason, and this is not necessarily to do with the populations who share the space with primates, but is ourselves and our own economic expectations rising. So the reason I'm showing this picture of a cell phone, and it's something that we'll talk about a little bit later, is that when we have electronics have circuit boards in them that actually require particular minerals like coltan, and those are minerals that are found in particular in actually the Democratic Republic of Congo and around equatorial Africa in rainforests. And so a lot of mining companies have been cutting down rainforests to get at these minerals. And this is not for the local people, this is for us, right? And same with all of our furniture needs. We're cutting down hardwood so that we can have nice Brazilian cherry hardwood floors in our homes and things like that. But there are a lot of our own desires that are fueling some of these changes. Another problem in the developing world is that the national parks that have been gazetted are actually quite poorly defended. Even our own national park, which is about 800 square kilometers, has, maybe a handful of national park guards. So it's not like when we think of Yellowstone National Park and there are gates that you have to drive through and permits that you have to get. They do have park boundaries, but they're not fenced in. And there aren't hundreds of people patrolling who is coming in and out of this park. At most, an area the size of my field site, which is 800 square kilometers, is going to have at most half a dozen guards at any one time. And so these parks are incredibly poorly defended. And one of the examples is Kahuzi-Biega National Park in eastern Congo, which before the 1990s was home to 8,000 gorillas. This is a part of the world where one of these minerals, coltan, that's used in cell phones in particular, was found. And in the 1990s, illegal mining operations in Kahuzi-Biega National Park, where miners were living in the park trying to get at coltan, what resulted is that about 7,000 gorillas got killed for food for the miners during one decade. And so the population in Kahuzi-Biega of gorillas is essentially, not viable anymore because there just isn't enough manpower to defend these parks. And then finally, as I said, most primates live in equatorial forests, so we know why. So now let's actually think about the specific threats. So one of the threats is obviously habitat loss, right? Just in general habitat loss, whether it's due to climate change or people cutting down forests. So if most of the primates are in these equatorial forests and we're losing them, that's going to be a big problem. And different people over the last 30 years have tried to estimate how quickly tropical forests are falling. Actually, most estimates have us losing all of the world's tropical forests between the years 2030 and 2050. Right now, we're actually, these estimates were done, kind of in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And what we find is that we're actually kind of squarely in between. So these projections are happening, even though they were made 20 years ago. We are losing tropical rainforests at about this loss. So it would not surprise me if we continue that we would actually have lost all of the tropical rainforests on Earth by about 2050. That's not that surprising. Let me show you a particular example, which is the island of Borneo, which is home to one of the orangutan subspecies. And here are some data. The green cover on the island of Borneo is the cover of tropical rainforest on the island. And what you can see is over these kind of intervals, real loss of tropical rainforest habitat in the island of Borneo. And the estimate right now, so right now it shows between 2010 and 2020, we're actually closer on Borneo to what it looks like, what it's supposed to look like in 2020. So probably over 50% of the tropical rainforest on the island of Borneo has been lost in the last 50 to 60 years. Now, the reason in Borneo for this tropical forest loss, and this is probably not news to anybody in particular, is in particular the increase in oil palm plantations on the island. So oil palm is the crop that gives us palm oil, which is an ingredient in, if you go to the grocery store, it's an ingredient in almost every processed food that we have on our shelves. So I could challenge all of you to actually go to the grocery store and see how much of the food that you buy and eat on a daily basis has palm oil in it. And I think you'll be very, very surprised to see that most of it does. And what you can see is, especially in Southeast Asia and in parts of Southeast Asia in particular, there's just huge increase in the amount of hectares of oil palm in Southeast Asia. And particularly this is happening on the island of Borneo. We see a little oil palm agriculture in Africa, but not nearly as much as we see it kind of just booming in Asia. And what happens when we have this kind of drive to cut down forests in order to grow agricultural crops is that we have primates, and orangutans in particular in this example, who now no longer have homes, right? What you can see behind this orangutan is land that tropical rainforest that has been now cleared for oil palm. One of the ways that tropical rainforests are cleared is through slash and burn agriculture. And so I am going to show you some two very disturbing images on the next slides. But one of the things that happened about 2 years ago is that some of those fires that were lit in order to burn down the forest went out of control. And so there were these raging forest fires all over the island of Borneo. And a lot of primates got caught in those fires. And here is a picture of an orangutan who suffered some third-degree burns as a result of being caught in these forest fires. This individual did later die. We don't actually know the exact numbers of orangutans who lost their lives due to this forest fire, but remember that there are only about 50,000 left in the world. That includes the orangutans on Sumatra. So on Borneo, there are fewer than that. And we probably lost a few thousand individuals due to these forest fires. Not only did we lose them because they got caught in the fires, but when they lost their habitat, they also lost all access to food. And so we also recovered many individuals, again, a very disturbing photo, I'm sorry, but individuals who were found starving to death. And here's a mother and her baby, both of whom later died, who just didn't have access to food due to the forest fires and were stuck without anything to eat. And unfortunately, this is not an uncommon sight for us when we are talking about great apes, and this is why we call this an extinction crisis. Now, this is not unique to the island of Borneo, so we have agricultural crops all over the world that are being grown that are cutting down forests. So in the neotropics, a lot of rainforest, a lot of the Amazon is being cut down for soy and for cattle feeding. Soy is actually a really interesting one because I think a lot of us are like really focused on cattle grazing in the Amazon, but don't realize how much of the Amazon is being lost to soy products. In Asia, it's not just oil palm, but also rubber. And all over the tropics, we find industrial hardwood kind of being a driving force with losing the rainforest. One of the things that happens when forests are cut down, this may be, I hope you can see this. This is actually a satellite image of our national park that I work in. The yellow dot is Kanyawara, which is my field site. And what this satellite image shows is how when we cut down national park, or when we cut down rainforest, what we end up doing is creating islands of forest in a habitat that is surrounded by agriculture. And that means a lot of different things. One is you've now created kind of isolated a group of individuals so that they don't have as much genetic transfer between their populations. So you've kind of genetically isolated a population. But you've also created a situation where, especially for individuals who are living on the edges of that forest, their habitat is now on the border with agricultural crops. And primates are very much driven by food. And if I were a primate and I was in my forest and I looked across the road and saw sugar cane or maize or some other crop, those would be pretty appealing and tasty. And so when we cut down forests and create these islands in a sea of agricultural crops, we also create a problem of crop raiding, where wild animals will go into people's farms to eat crops. This is a problem not just for primates, but elephants. This is a huge problem for people killing elephants in the world. And I'm going to show you another photo that's a little bit disturbing. But one of the things that happened to one of our individuals who went crop raiding, this is one of our males, Emoso, is he went crop raiding. He doesn't know that. I mean, he doesn't know that someone owned that maize. And the villagers actually speared him and sliced his arm open. We were able to actually give him veterinary care, so he survived this. But lots of animals lose their lives in these situations because. And I kind of sympathize because that's the livelihood of those people. And so, whereas a chimp may take a couple of pieces of maize, it might not be that destructive. An elephant can ruin your whole crop. And so, elephants in particular are very much, it's a problem. Crop raiding is a big problem for elephant conservation. This is also a problem in Borneo, going back to the orangutans. This is a really interesting paper that looked at crop raiding by orangutans on the island of Borneo. And what they did was they went around to different rural areas and kind of did a survey, and they figured out that in 1 year alone, in 2008, up to 1,800 orangutans were killed due to them going crop raiding. And of the 7,000 people that were interviewed, 25% said that they had killed at least one orangutan. That's a lot of orangutans lost. That wasn't necessarily killed that year, but killed in their lifetime. And so this paper estimated that adult female mortality was as high as 3.6%. And that might not, but to put that number into perspective a little bit, in order for us to keep the orangutan population what it is, female mortality has to be under 1%. So the fact that it's 3 times higher than what we need it to be to just keep them where they are is problematic. And right now we're thinking that the numbers of orangutans, this number came from 2008 with the forest fires and with some changes over the last, in oil palm over the last decade. I think the number of orangutans killed or dying every year is probably closer to about 2,000 to 3,000 individuals. And this is, remember, a species that only has 50,000 left. And so our estimate for orangutan survival is pretty grim. I mean, most people would estimate that they're probably not going to be alive in the wild by the year 2030, which is only 12 years away. So this really is a crisis, and it's not something that we can afford to wait on because we don't really have the time to save this particular species. Now, another problem besides just habitat loss and crop raiding is that a lot of primates are not just killed because they're crop raiding, but they're killed because they represent a source of food. And this is what we call bushmeat. So again, some gruesome pictures, I'm sorry, but especially in West Africa, we see the hunting of primates is much more widespread. In East Africa, there are some certain cultural taboos that prevent people from killing apes at least. But essentially what people do is a lot of times is they may go into the forest with machine guns and just spray the canopy with bullets and collect anything that falls out and then sell it in the market. Sometimes they will end up trying to capture individuals alive, and you might see animals in the market who are still alive. But these are high value meats, so this is something that's kind of a specialty meat. It's considered a delicacy in a lot of different parts of the world, so a lot of people will get quite a bit of money for this. There is also a booming international trade, so it's not uncommon to see kind of illicit bushmeat markets in Europe and America for people who want to know what chimpanzee would taste like, so they're being smuggled. And one of the problems with the bushmeat trade is that often mothers are killed, and that leaves orphans, leaves these baby chimpanzees or baby orangutans who are left as orphans. you will sometimes see them on the side of the road, or people will kind of, we'll hear stories that there's a baby chimp in some village and we'll go and get them. But you have to do something with them. They don't have a mother anymore. They need someone to help raise them. I mean, these are animals that need a lot of parenting. And so what's happened in Africa and in Asia is that we see, and also in South America to some extent, we see the growth of these orphanages, chimpanzee sanctuaries, and orangutan sanctuaries where babies are taken when their mothers are killed due to bushmeat or some other problems. The problem is that most of these we never anticipated that we would need more. We would need, for the one in Uganda, I don't think anyone anticipated that we would need more than 40 spaces. And really, there are probably hundreds of individuals all over Africa that are being orphaned all the time. So it's a problem. It's a big cost. It's all sorts of things. Now, where I work in Uganda, there's not a thriving bushmeat market for chimpanzee meat or primate meat, but there is a bushmeat trade for things like antelopes and pigs. And so hunters will come into the forest and set traps for small mammals. And one of the problems is that the chimpanzees and primates are pretty curious, and so especially the 5-year-olds. So if any of you have kids, you may know that, for the most part, kids may walk behind their mother, but generally about the age of 5, they start running ahead of their mom. And while moms are pretty good at identifying where traps and snares are, the 5-year-olds are not so clever at that, and they're not used to it. And so what happens generally when they're in that kind of childhood period, we do see a lot of our chimpanzees get injured. And here are some examples of some of our injuries. So Harare, you can see, is missing her left hand, and Twig is missing his right hand. And both of them were snared. These are snare injuries or trap injuries when they were little. And what's interesting is that they do survive. We will do medical interventions if we have to. A lot of times they will survive. They end up being okay in terms of feeding efficiency. This is Max, and if you have not already noticed Max, Max actually lost both of his feet to snare injuries when he was, the first when he was 5 and the second when he was 8. And I think he should be everyone's next superhero chimp, because I'm going to just show you a quick video of Max just to show you that they actually do end up being okay. So this is Max going through the canopy. He still has his hands, so he can still climb pretty well. And he gets by. He survives. So you'll see how he uses his legs when he comes back on the screen. So he ends up having to crawl on his shins quite a bit. Now, the fact that he's alive, I don't want that to kind of give you some idea that he's like a perfectly normal chimp and he's not going to be affected by this at all, because in reality, Max will never be high-ranking. He's never going to be able to be a dominant male chimp in his community. In fact, he's an adult now and he's the lowest-ranking chimp in our group. So certainly these injuries are affecting them in terms of the lives that they could have had, I think. Now, there is an interesting conundrum with some of the bushmeat trade. And I think one of the things is very apparent in Madagascar, which is this study that Chris Golden did, which showed that there are different households in Madagascar have different reliance on bushmeat. So some have a low reliance on bushmeat and some have a high reliance on bushmeat. What they did was this public health study where they looked at what would happen if we removed bushmeat consumption from these high reliance households. And what this graph is showing is that the removal of bushmeat from the diet of these households that have high reliance on bushmeat would increase childhood anemia by about 30%. And so there's this conundrum because, we have this deep desire to save these primates and save chimpanzees and orangutans, but we also have to consider the local people that are living around these parks and maybe relying on some of these, on bushmeat, or might really need to cut down forest in order to feed their families. And so do we kill a lemur to save a child, or do we save the lemur? And I think that's one of the things that we face as conservation biologists. I'm not going to talk too much about it today. It's a complicated subject, but one of the other areas that we also worry about, particularly with the great apes, is that disease can cause major losses in great ape populations. So we are an ape, which means that we genetically share a lot of information with the great apes, especially chimpanzees. And so it's not surprising that they can be subject to the same diseases that we have. And across Africa, we know that Ebola outbreaks have killed a large number. Ebola outbreaks in humans have killed a large number of the apes. In this one site in Gabon, we know that there was a 99% decline in gorilla populations due to Ebola. In different chimpanzee sites, we know that at certain times, about 50% of populations have been lost due to Ebola. But it's not just these catastrophic diseases like Ebola that we worry about, because chimpanzees are also subject to just things like the common cold. And so in 2013 at my field site, we lost 10% of our population due to a cold, for example. So disease can also be a major problem, especially as you have more and more people entering the park and exposing those apes to these diseases. Okay, so what can we do? That's the doom and gloom. Let's end the talk with some more positives. The positive is that conservation can work, right? We can do something to help some of these populations. So what I'm showing you here is the graph of the mountain gorilla populations, and starting in the 60s when Diane Fossey kind of started seeing them and studying them, we know there were about 400 individuals. That number declined to its low of about 200 individuals in 1980. And what happened was there was this, because we were at 200 individuals, there was this huge push from both the governments of these countries as well as the international community to save this species, to save this incredibly charismatic species. And over time, through a lot of research money, a lot of attention, a lot of international attention, a lot of ecotourism, that number has now gone up to 1,000 individuals. So we've, increased this population by 5 times over the last 30 years, and that has taken a lot of work, but you can do it. We just have to make sure we have the habitat that these animals can live in order to do some of these conservation solutions. I would like to make a pitch. Obviously, I'm a researcher, so I'd like to make a pitch for the benefit of long-term research as a driving factor for conservation, just like Diane Fossey's site started as a research site and Jane Goodall's site started as research sites. I think having long-term research, bringing attention to these places is a real benefit to conservation. I think for a number of reasons. One of the things is having long-term researchers there means that there's a constant presence in the forest, especially in areas and national parks where maybe the governments can't afford to have a large National Guard presence. And so that also allows us to monitor and to control illegal activity. And also, many of the research sites are actually really actively involved in developing ecotourism sites, which brings more attention to groups. I'd like to highlight the work that my project does, which is the Kibale Chimpanzee Project. So besides an extensive research program, one of the things that we started in about 1990 was a project to remove the snares in the forest. So those chimps were getting caught in these bushmeat traps, losing arms and legs and hands and feet and toes. And so we developed this program where we actually have a dedicated staff members whose sole job is to patrol the forest and remove snares. And in any given year, we remove between probably 1,000 to 2,000 illegal snares, as well as find lots of other illegal activity. Just want to point out that we actually don't just patrol this is concentrated in the area where our chimps live and where we work, but we actually patrol a much, much wider area. And what you can see, it's probably not the best figure, but there's this blue blob in the middle here on the right side map. That's where our chimpanzees live. What you'll find is that our presence in the forest, we actually don't find that many snares in that location, and I think that's because we're present there, so hunters don't tend to set snares in that location. That means that they're setting them in other locations, which is why our patrol effort has to be much larger than just our home range. So we actually patrol almost the entire northern half of that park, but that does seem to prevent a lot of illegal activity in the park. I'd also like to point out the other thing about research is that research can also lead to other kinds of conservation efforts. So research in our park started in about 1970, and you can see that as more and more people started doing research there, other kinds of research started happening. So the chimps were studied in the 70s, then monkeys, then fish, then another chimps, and all sorts of other things. Research drives research because we build infrastructure and it attracts other researchers. But because we're building infrastructure, we also attract a lot of people who are interested in doing community development projects. So just the fact that there are roads there makes it an accessible area to now start helping people. And so these are all of the corollary community development projects that have come into place since we started research. And I'd like to highlight one in particular, obviously the one that I'm involved in, which is called the Cassini Project. And what we do is we actually work with about 16 schools that are within 5 kilometers of the national park boundary. And we serve probably close to about 10,000 school children. And the mission of this project is to essentially conserve Kibale National Park, but we do it by giving those kids as much opportunity as possible. So if you can think of anything you would do to make a school better or to give kids a better life, we do it. And the idea is that if we can give any of those kids a better life and give them opportunity to go on and further their education or do other things, they won't necessarily turn to cutting down the forest for their living. So even though it's a conservation project at its heart, a lot of what we do are, girls' health initiatives, literacy initiatives, all sorts of things. I mean, I did a project where I taught kids photography for a summer. So again, I never thought 15 years ago I'd be teaching photography to kids in Uganda, but such is life. But essentially it is a conservation project. And we found some great success. So at our Cassini schools in yellow, we actually find better leaving scores. These are like standardized testing where the lower the score, the better you've done. And at our schools, our kids do better academically. So some of our programs are working in terms of getting them opportunities for scholarships. But we also know a lot of what we do is we give them all sorts of things, opportunities and programming, but we also often tack on a conservation message to some of those things. And we have a conservation education program, and we can show that over time, if they're in our conservation program, their knowledge about the forest increases with their participation in the program. We know this has long-lasting effects, so even up to 5 years. We know that the kids go home and force their parents to do things that are eco-friendly, which is kind of how a lot of conservation messages get passed on all over the world. And we know that we have, even in a short amount of time, changed their attitude to the national park. So it goes from being very negative to very positive. So just by giving people opportunities, we think that this is a way of trying to do conservation outside of the park, while our research and our snare removal efforts are trying to do conservation within the park. And finally, I'll just end with this story that I think is kind of amazing, which is one of the reasons that it's really important to focus on local people is that they are the ones, at the end of the day, who live in these places, and the forest is theirs. Those gorillas or chimps are really part of their heritage. And this is a story from the Grace Gorilla Sanctuary. It's a more complicated story than I'm going to tell you, but in 2013, there was a push to take some of the gorillas who had been orphaned and left in the sanctuary and move them to China in exchange for trade deals. Okay, so that's illegal. We can talk about that later, but anyway. Now, the Grace Gorilla Sanctuary is in this place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the Katoyo community had donated their land, their sacred ancestral land, for this sanctuary. And the sanctuary, in turn, does a lot of things for the community, like school efforts, supplies, healthcare workers, all sorts of things. And even though no Westerners were actually at the sanctuary at this time, when they came to remove the gorillas or to assess which gorillas were going to be moved to China, what happened was that the local community formed basically like a human barricade outside the sanctuary and prevented people from taking the gorillas away. This is not something that anyone told them to do. They just moved their morning prayer meeting to that area. And this is why we want to invest in local communities and why we think it's important. And if local communities can see the benefit of having apes around them and the benefits of having these species live around them, then we think there's a benefit to everybody. But there really has to be a benefit to them. And so part of that means investing in these communities. So I want to end just quickly with some little strategies that you can think about, like you can use in your everyday life about what you can do. I think one very easy thing is to just be a more mindful consumer. Go to the grocery store, look at your home, see how much stuff that you eat has palm oil. Think about, are there ways that you can replace those foods with other foods that don't have palm oil? Think about what you buy in terms of how much of it is made up of tropical hardwoods. Brazilian cherry is beautiful, but it came from the Amazon and it was illegally harvested. There's no doubt in my mind that that is true. I'm super embarrassing to my husband because if I see mahogany in a store, I'll stand by that table and question everybody who tries to look at it and prevent them from buying it. But I think it's important that we are more mindful about where our stuff comes from. Another very easy one is obviously donate to conservation organizations. A lot of the money that we use for our snare removal project or for our school project comes from places like zoos. So a lot of zoos fund conservation initiatives, but we don't get research money for that. So this is something that we have to work really hard to get those dollars. And you know, for example, our school project, a lot of that funding has come from Disney, and I think a lot of people don't realize how much money zoos and different organizations give to conservation. And so I think you should ask questions about where your money is going. Make sure it's going to actual conservation rather than to overhead if you can help it. But don't be afraid of sponsoring zoos, especially those that support a lot of conservation initiatives. I think surprisingly, another thing that I would really want people to know about is how you're using social media. There are lots and lots of cute pictures of primates dressed up, or primates that are on TV or being, used in all sorts of ways. But the reality is that when people see pictures of humans holding baby chimpanzees or baby orangutans who are dressed up in cute clothes, most people, or they see primates on TV, most people are more likely to believe that they're not endangered. Because if they can be on TV, there must be a lot of them in the wild. And so when you think about what you're liking on Facebook or Twitter or sharing, think about how that might be affecting animals who are endangered. And a lot of the animals that we see in these posts are probably the products of an illegal pet trade. And just to be aware that sometimes the things that you're posting have a big impact on how people view endangered species, I think is really important. Another message, recycle your electronics. Think about how every mineral in there probably came from a tropical rainforest, potentially illegally, and the more that we can recycle those minerals, the less value there is in getting them from these tropical habitats. So that's a very simple thing I think everyone should go home and do today. And finally, I think it's a great thing if you can afford it to support ecotourism. A lot of money from ecotourism goes back into the countries that have these apes. It goes into supporting the hiring and salaries of national park guards. I can tell you from experience that a lot of this money does go back to the country, so it is being used for conservation, and it is a phenomenal experience. If you have never had a chance to trek with mountain gorillas, it is expensive, but it is completely worth it. It's a life-changing experience, and I'm happy if you ever want to email me to ask different questions about which ecotourism groups to support, or not every company is going to be great, to please email me because I can give you some advice about that. So on that note, I would like to say thank you. I hope you learned a lot about conservation. I hope I haven't left you with too much doom and gloom. I will take questions in a second. I do just want to highlight that the next Tufts faculty webinar will be on February 7th from noon to 1 p.m., so the same time, by Nima Mazaheri. And this is a political scientist at Tufts who's going to talk about the perils and promise of oil wealth. So if we have about 5 minutes left, if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to take them in just type them in the Q&A box, the text box, which is on the bottom right of the screen. One of the questions someone asked is, do any of these critically endangered species reproduce in captivity? It's a complicated question, so some of them do. I'll just focus on the apes, for example. Chimpanzees tend not to have much problem reproducing in captivity. Mountain gorillas actually do. So mountain gorillas, there are no mountain gorillas in captivity. We can't keep them in captivity. Every mountain gorilla in captivity has always died. even the orphans, actually, we have a very hard time keeping them alive in captivity. They seem to be much, much more fragile. So an orphan baby chimp, if we get them at 3, we can generally keep them alive for the rest of their life in a sanctuary. A mountain gorilla, if we get them at the age of 3, they will most likely die. So there are differences, and part of that is we just don't, I think we don't know enough about things about their diets and habitats and how to really kind of recreate them in a captive setting. And I think that there just are differences to how some of these baby orphaned primates are going to react to the stress of losing their mother. And mountain gorillas are pretty fragile. Orangutans seem, they will reproduce in captivity. Another question is the chart for oil palm plantations you provided from a journal article, and if so, could you provide the citation? I would be happy to. It's from an article by Estrada from 2017, and we can actually post that or provide that on one of the slides after, so I'd be happy to add that. A question, what inspired me to become a primatologist? I wanted to be a primatologist since I was very young. It's actually a longer story than that, but when I was 4, I saw a documentary of chimps being sent to space, and they interviewed Jane Goodall and they interviewed John Glenn, and underneath each of their names it said primatologist and astronaut, and so I went to the World Book Encyclopedia and I looked up both of them, both of those potential careers, and I thought, well, these are both amazing and I can't choose between them, so I'm going to be an astronaut. Well, I actually decided I'd be an astronaut veterinarian, because if you're going to send chimps to space, someone needed to take care of them. So from a very, very early age, I really wanted to at least work with animals. When I did not meet the height requirement for NASA, which was a very, very upsetting time in my life, I decided that I would focus my efforts on becoming a wildlife veterinarian, and the reason that I chose to go into primatology instead of veterinary work is that I had this amazing experience in college where I got to work with some captive chimpanzees who had been retired from biomedical research, and I found everything about their behavior fascinating, so I decided to pursue a PhD in primatology instead. And then another question is, are there areas where protected lands could be connected by corridors of rainforest to permit greater breeding and genetic diversity, and can ecotourism support and maintain such projects? Absolutely, there are areas where you could do protected lands. This is a big topic more for elephant conservation, because elephants have such big migration patterns across Africa that you really do need kind of corridors between areas. It's hard, though, because land is expensive, and so to really figure out how to buy large enough swaths of land to connect these rainforests is very difficult to imagine how you can turn things that are already farmland that are owned by people into corridors that are big enough. I mean, think about the size of a corridor you would need for elephants. It can't just be like 5 meters that they're not going to just kind of stay in that one area. But yes, I do think ecotourism can support and maintain such projects. There are some groups in Tanzania right now that are working on that corridors between pockets of rainforest for chimp habitat, and that is being supported by both research money and by ecotourism dollars. So another question is, how does diurnality affect primate survivability? I think one of the reasons that being a diurnal primate, so something that lives during the day, will affect primates is that that's when humans are active. So humans and diurnal primates are going to come into contact with each other much more often than humans and nocturnal primates. So I think that there's just more opportunity for that. Another question is it possible for Tufts to organize a trek to visit your park? I think that's something that we are talking about, and so I think possibly in the near future that is something that we might try to do with the Tufts Alumni Organization. And someone else wrote, I'd love to make a donation towards your cause, and how can I do this? And we would very much appreciate it, so I would be very happy to share that information as well. We'll add a slide at the end when we post the webinar that will allow us so that you can look at our website. We have a website that will take donations, and we are registered as 501c3s, so they are tax deductible. And with that, it's now 1 p.m. I would like to thank you again for taking the time to learn a little bit about primate conservation, and I hope that this is something that you'll discuss with friends and family and spread the word, because that's another thing that you can do, and make sure everyone knows that this crisis is going on. So again, thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the talk today.